Welcome, everyone. I'm Noah Reed, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Precision Analytical, creators of the DUTCH Test. Thank you all for joining us on this Q&A with our very own Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton. Visual representation plays an important role in conveying complex information on DUTCH reports. As we strive for continuous improvement and clarity in our reports, we are excited to announce some enhancements to the DUTCH report aimed at improving readability and providing deeper insights into the data. In this Q&A, Dr. Smeaton will address providers' most asked questions about the visual updates to their DUTCH report, how report interpretation may change, and how these updates can help providers create more meaningful conversations around treatment for their patients. If you're ready to start using DUTCH testing in your practice, sign up as a registered provider today. Click the link we've posted in the chat and complete our provider application form. A member of our onboarding team will walk you through the steps to set up an account so that you can begin taking advantage of all the education and resources that DUTCH has to offer. Plus, registered providers gain access to the Mastering Functional Hormone Testing course, the DUTCH Interpretive Guide, and one-on-one consultations with DUTCH clinical educators. This dedicated support and education is designed to help you become the hormone expert. Now let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton is the Chief Medical Officer at Precision Analytical, creators of the DUTCH Test, and a naturopathic physician focused on infertility and reproductive health. In addition to her private practice, Hello Fertility, she is a prolific teacher in the field of reproductive endocrinology and hormones and has trained thousands of clinicians on her treatment methodology. Dr. Smeaton has extensive leadership experience in integrative medicine, including as the president of the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians, as an ambassador for the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, and as a board member of the Integrative Health Policy Consortium. And now, without further ado, Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Noah. I'm really excited for this month's webinar to get to walk you through the new report elements that we've launched on the DUTCH. Now, it's been a while since we've made really significant updates, so I'm glad you're here. We're not going to take up too much of your time, but we're going to go through what those are, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the report in action with some of the early reports that were produced with this new format. And then we're going to go into your questions that were submitted previously. So, like I said, this is the first visual report update in several years. Some of it is just design changes, but there is some new science in there, and we'll focus on that today. Now, the first change is that all of the fan gauges, which you can see here from the old report, have shifted to be shown as a slider bar. Now, this is an example of one to the next, and you can see the red line pointing, just outside of that kind of zone in the middle. And same thing here, this caret right in the same location. These are really showing the same information. This is the methylation slider, but now you'll see that there's an addition of a number down below. Now, the data that's presented with these two different visuals is exactly the same. There's no change in the lab. There's no change in what we're reporting. But what's showing you there with the number is where someone falls on the population percentile. And that's what it showed as a fan gauge as well. We just didn't give you that actual number. So now this population percentile is the number showing you how your patient's results compares to others. And that's other samples that have come through our lab, which is in the tens of thousands, huge numbers of samples, maybe even hundreds of thousands. So the way that this would read would be that this patient's methylation is better than 81% of the samples that we've processed through the lab. You can see there's only about 9% of people who have more efficient methylation than this. Now, these slider bars were updated on methylation, on 5-alpha reductase, which used to be represented as a fan gauge, and then on the 11-beta HSD, which is the cortisol to cortisone metabolite preferences that are reported there. So you'll see these really throughout the report. This allows us to have a little bit more space on the report, updates the design a bit, and then allows us to add the actual numerical value for your population percentile. You can see how those show up here. Here's the 5-alpha reductase slider as another example. And you'll probably notice two new sliders, which are new information. Those are in the bottom right-hand corner of page 3 of the DUTCH Plus and the DUTCH Complete. And this is the addition of reported estrogen metabolite ratios. This includes both the 2:16 ratio and the 2:4 ratio. And this is looking at the 2-hydroxy-E1 to 16-hydroxy-E1, and 2-hydroxy to 4-hydroxy-E1 balance. The reason why we added these, a couple of reasons. One, it aligns better with clinical research. So when the test first came out, we had this pie chart view. And what that did was it really provided you with a 3-way comparison of metabolites. And we would give you kind of the range that you'd be looking for here, these expected percentages, and you could see where your patient fell. But adding these ratios gives you a better idea of where those comparisons are. And you'll see, I'll give you a couple of examples that showed up just in our first day of reviewing reports coming out of the lab, real clinical patient data, where the pie chart doesn't really show, or it can kind of obscure an imbalance. I'll show you that momentarily. The other piece is that these really align with clinical research. So if you look at studies on breast cancer, there's some on small cell lung cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, endometriosis. More and more studies are looking at the relative ratios. And so you're not looking to achieve a specific ratio target, but what they do is they look at patients with breast cancer, for example, and they find that women with breast cancer tend to favor 16-OH compared to women who don't. In the control arm, they tend to favor 2. And so you're not really looking for a specific target for a ratio, but it's helpful to see where your patient falls relatively. Here's just a couple of examples. Many of you probably know Dr. Smith, one of the docs on our team. And this was an example that came through where she saw that the favor towards 2-OH isn't as much as she expected to see on the sliders, with over 80% 2-OH on the pie chart. So you can see in this case, the 2-OH took up the majority of the pie chart. You'd think, wow, they have a really strong preference to 2-OH. But actually, when you look at the ratios based upon where they should be, the 2-OH balance here is actually not as favorable as you would have thought. You might have thought you'd expect this carrot to be all the way up here, but it's actually only at 38%, just slightly below normal. Probably still not a problem for this patient. However, that pie chart didn't really represent what the balance would truly look like. This is another really great example. The team lovingly calls these blueberry pies, which I think is the funniest word in the whole world. You see this sometimes where people have a very strong preference to 16-hydroxy E1. And when this happens, it can obscure the relationship between 2 and 4. So you would expect with this, oh yeah, they definitely have a 16 preference, and you can see that here. But what you probably didn't anticipate, especially because the 4-OH is below the level that we would see here, 7.5 to 11%, below that target range, you're really missing with that pie chart the fact that there's such a strong preference for 4-OH when you look at just 4-OH and 2-OH balance. So this is probably a problematic metabolism for this patient because they really strongly prefer the 16 and the 4-OH metabolites, really don't have enough 2-OH metabolism. This is just another fun example. This is one that you can see the team's chat when these came out. They were so excited about it. This is a sample where the patient was on DIM, and you can see how well the DIM worked to kind of push to that 2-OH preference here. So really exciting the way that these additional ratios can make it so easy for you to evaluate that phase 1 estrogen metabolism. So now I want to go ahead and dive into your questions. Okay, so now we've covered the enhancements to the DUTCH report and why we've made them. I want to answer the questions that you have raised regarding these changes. So the first question, if my test is already in process, will the enhancements be reflected on my report? So we made this change on the night of May 1st. So if the samples were received on May 2nd or later, then these enhancements will be reflected on your patient's report. You'll start to see them. If you've received a report from DUTCH in the last couple of weeks, you will have seen these changes. Will the cycle map be included? So the cycle map is not included as far as the tests go because we don't have any slider bars, and the additional estrogen metabolites aren't on there. If you do the cycle map plus, then or with the cycle map paired with the DUTCH Complete or the DUTCH Plus, then you will of course see them. Okay, next question. Why do we need to know where we fall on the spectrum? This is such a great question. And the reason why is that published studies are now showing that the preference that you have with phase 1 estrogen metabolism has correlations with specific diseases. I mentioned some of these before: rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. Some of them are kind of surprising to me, but also some of the things, primarily breast cancer, small cell lung cancer, even some vascular diseases are related to estrogen metabolism. So it can be really helpful, particularly when you're trying to figure out what's going on for a patient and what their root cause is. Understanding their estrogen metabolism and the preferences can be a really helpful piece of the puzzle. Okay, next question. Who is the comparison group? Is it people who take the DUTCH test? So, yes, our comparison group, when we look at those slider bars, the population percentile is based upon looking at the population of testers who've come through our lab. As I mentioned, there's a large number in that population now. We get healthy individuals, we get people who are probably on the far ends of the spectrum, but reference ranges and those population percentiles are based upon that bell curve that you typically see within a population when you test for anything. So we set those up the same way that any lab would be, setting those values. Okay, next question. Can you tell us what the optimal ratios are for those working with the current DUTCH? So, as I mentioned earlier or alluded to, there's not a specific numerical ratio target that I've seen in literature. Really, what they look at is they're comparing one group to another. And so, we don't really recommend that you look at it from a target perspective. We just want to show you where your patient's ratio falls in relationship with others. And it's tough because when we were talking about how to represent this on the test, we did indicate kind of a green zone, meaning that if they're within that normal kind of average range, they're probably okay. But that might change in the future if studies more clearly identify a cutoff number. But right now, the science isn't there. So we can't make that assumption without that data to back it up. If you do want to know the actual ratio, and this might be helpful for you if you were wanting to look at before and after instituting a therapy like DIM or sulforaphane or something where you're trying to modify a ratio, those are reported on page 2. So on page 2, which is just the table representation of all of the results, you can see the population percentile, and also you can look at the actual calculated ratio number. Okay, next question. Would the comparison be with females in your age group? So the comparison is just across all patients. It's not specific to male and female when it comes to estrogen metabolism. Of course, we see huge differences in the normal ranges for the total estrogens made, but when it comes to metabolism, there's not huge distinct differences between men and women. Are population bars age represented? They are not. They don't need to be. Actually, we're looking at, again, because estrogen metabolism isn't age dependent, the way something like androgens, estrogen would be, they are not age specific. Okay, next question. How do I manage HRT according to the results? So, when it comes to HRT, this is such a great question. We get asked this a lot. And estrogen metabolism is really important to consider when you're thinking about HRT. We like to recommend that you actually get a good assessment of a patient's estrogen metabolism prior to instituting HRT. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, it can help you identify women where they might be at a higher risk for side effects or risk factors for things like cancer if you were to dump more estrogen into the system. So if you can look at metabolism, and let's say you saw a 16-OH and 4-OH preference, the patient didn't make a lot of 2-OH. They didn't send a lot down that preferred pathway. You might be concerned that adding more estradiol or any estrogens into the system would only elevate those problematic metabolites. And so, with that, you might think about altering metabolism with supplementation while the patient's on HRT. And this would allow you to let them know how it's so important and why, why you'd want to be moving things down a cleaner pathway. That's how I would look at it. So, you can test before, get a good baseline assessment. And then we recommend that around 8-12 weeks after therapy, once that patient's symptoms have stabilized, resolved, then you would want to retest. And when there's a lot of estrogen in the system, you can get a really good read on the estrogen metabolism. Who can I contact for questions regarding these enhancements? Well, you can always call our customer service or you can contact our doctor team, particularly if you have questions about a patient's results. And there's many ways you can get in touch with our team. We have a Dr. Dutch email that you can send to. We have same day consultation service where on our website you can click a button to fill out a form, and one of our docs will call you back. They just kind of rotate and call everyone that submits on that list. Or you can schedule a consultation at your convenience. And all of those are accessible through the provider portal. So when you click into the portal on the left-hand side, you can see all the links to get in for that same day consult, scheduled consultation, and what we call Ask Dr. Dutch, the email. Great question. That really wraps up our questions about the enhancement. So there were a couple of other questions that were submitted that are a little bit more general. The first one is which Dutch test would you recommend for fertility? Ooh, now I love this question because that's an area that I absolutely love is fertility. In my own practice, I always look at the Dutch Plus and sometimes with the cycle map as well. It really depends upon what you're trying to look at. So the Dutch Plus I find extremely helpful for fertility because you can get an idea of estrogen, progesterone, androgen production, and all the downstream metabolites. You also get the opportunity to see whether that patient's ovulating, what their hormone, kind of relative hormone production is. And you get to look at other areas that can impact fertility, like the HPA axis. Now, with the Dutch Plus, you get the CAR, the cortisol awakening response. That's done in saliva, and it's 3 samples done in the first hour of, it's upon waking, 30 minutes, and 60 minutes after waking. And that acts as a mini stress test. And I really like to add that because it's another independent marker of a patient's resilience and their HPA axis function, which we know stress and HPA axis dysfunction is a contributing factor for infertility. Lastly, on both the Dutch Complete and the Dutch Plus, you also get all these organic acids, and a lot of them are very relevant for fertility. You get to look at things that identify B6 and B12 deficiency. 8-OHDG is another marker I love. That's for oxidative stress. And you get melatonin, which is a really critical antioxidant and nutrient for fertility as well. So really nice to get this comprehensive picture that looks at both nutritional, hormonal, and stress-related etiologies for infertility. Okay, next question. Can you use Dutch if you're on BHRT and you're menopausal? You absolutely can. We really recommend this. It's more than half of our business is HRT monitoring. Lots of test results come in on this. And the reason why it's so helpful is that we can help you identify kind of a target range that you should be aiming for therapy for your patients, particularly with estrogen therapies. Now, conventional medicine doesn't recommend monitoring. Definitely monitoring is more common in the precision and functional medicine approach to BHRT. And it makes a lot of sense because monitoring only based on symptom resolution, which is primarily hot flashes or vaginal dryness, there's a really high rate of placebo in published studies, like 50%. So meaning that half of patients that you give a patch or a gel or a cream that has no estrogen in it will still report improvement. So you really want to make sure that you're achieving the estrogen targets to not only get the results when it comes to symptom management, but also some of the other health benefits that are seen with estrogen replacement therapy. Things like bone protection, cardiovascular protection, brain and cognitive health. So that we know what range, we use the studies that are from bone. We know what estrogen ranges are necessary in serum to achieve bone protection. And we can actually calculate what those look like in urine. And really what we look for providers to target is to be outside of the postmenopausal range, in between the postmenopausal and luteal ranges on our dial, or up into about the bottom third of the luteal range. Some providers go higher. That's fine especially if you're more experienced and you're really making those targeted decisions for patients. But if you're newer to HRT and newer to using Dutch testing, that 0.7 to 1.8 is where that would fall on the estradiol dial is really where you want to target. You also, I mentioned before, you can take a look with BHRT at estrogen metabolism as well. We don't recommend using the progesterone as a way to monitor therapy. Really, you should be using doses that have been shown in clinical research to protect the endometrium if your patient is on progesterone because they have a uterus and you want to protect the uterus with HRT. Next question, how to track hormones during perimenopause. Now, this is really tricky because perimenopause hormones fluctuate up and down. So I would be asking, why are you looking to track the hormones in perimenopause? What are you hoping to accomplish? Because that would help us understand whether you should be doing a cycle map or just a Dutch Plus or Dutch Complete, and also, what test to run and when to order it. Now, one thing that is important to realize is that in perimenopause, hormones really fluctuate. So if you run a Dutch test during one cycle, especially if that cycle is atypical for the patient, the next cycle might look different. Estrogen might be low on one cycle and high on the next cycle. And that's really a hallmark of perimenopause. So I think that is actually one of the trickier times to test. And if you want to be testing a patient in perimenopause, you can always call us for support so that we can help you make sure you get the information to meet your patient's specific needs. Okay, the next question, how to use Dutch test if you have a hysterectomy? This is really a great question because if you're not bleeding, because you've had your uterus removed, but you still have ovaries, so you're still making hormones, how do you know what day to test on? Now, there's a couple of ways to do this. I think the easiest way is with a wearable. Like I've got an Oura ring. Apple watches also do temperature and cycle charting. So if you have some kind of device, you can do your oral temperature as well. You'll see a spike in temperature, about 0.3 of a degree. It's small, but it's measurable. And that happens the day after ovulation. So you want to look about 1 week after that temperature spike. Now, you can also identify ovulation based on an ovulation predictor kit, but that can be tricky because you might be doing it. Let's say you start, on cycle day 15, like one day after ovulation, you might be doing it for 30 days, and those get expensive. You can buy ones that are only paper, not in the plastic, packaging, that are cheaper, that are in a tube with like 30 strips. But I think that if you have access to doing oral temperature in the morning, right upon waking, that's an easier way to track. Okay, when do you test an amenorrheic teen? This is another question that's a lot like perimenopause. It can be very difficult, and it really depends upon the age of the teen. Again, hormones change a lot during puberty and perimenopause. We go through those changes twice, and it can be challenging to get the right day. So what I would recommend doing with this teen is maybe doing a cycle map to really try to understand the cycle first, and or you could use those same techniques, the Oura ring, or some kind of cycle monitoring, oral temperature, Oura ring. They have this Ava bracelet. There's a lot of tools out there that can help to identify ovulation. Okay, I think that is all of our questions. Thank you guys so much for joining me in this month's kind of special format webinar. Hopefully, you learned a lot and you are as excited about the changes to the test as we are. See you soon.
Again, thank you all for joining us today. Watch your inboxes tomorrow for a link to the recording and to access the resources we shared today. You can learn more about the research behind the Dutch test at dutchtest.com/research. And make sure you visit Become a Provider at DutchTest.com to register for an account so that you can gain access to even more hormone education and research. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Dutch Test for more hormone education, tips from our clinical experts, and much, much more. Have a great day.